On the morning of August 6, 1945, at precisely 8:14 a.m., a man sat bent over instruments in a small, cluttered laboratory in Tokyo, unaware that the very fabric of his world was about to be torn apart. Dr. Yoshio Nisha wasn't simply a competent scientist. He was Japan's most brilliant nuclear physicist, a man whose mind carried the imprint of the great European tradition, trained in Copenhagen under Niels Bohr, steeped in the language of quantum theory and fission, and entrusted with a secret project that had consumed his life for 3 years. He worked at the Riken Institute, a building of grey concrete and humming equipment that stood roughly 500 meters from the center of Hiroshima, a distance that, until that morning, had been an abstract number on a map. Now it would become a measurement of fate. On that particular morning, Nisha was wrestling with the same problem that had tormented him since 1942. It was a technical and moral puzzle rolled into one: uranium enrichment. The arithmetic of an atomic bomb was deceptively simple on paper, yet brutally unforgiving in the laboratory. To make a gun-type uranium device, you needed on the order of 50 kilograms of uranium-235. 50 kilograms. But nature had stacked the deck against them. Uranium-235 made up only about 7% of natural uranium. The other 93% was uranium-238, practically indistinguishable, chemically and obstinately inert for the purposes of fission. Separating those two nearly identical isotopes was like trying to sort identical twins by their breath alone. In the dark, while the clock of war kept ticking, Nisha and his team had an answer: thermal diffusion. The method worked in principle. In tiny, carefully controlled columns, they could nudge isotopes apart. But scale matters in war and in physics. The Riken Institute's apparatus yielded grams, where the bomb required kilograms. At the rate they were producing enriched material, building a single weapon would take decades. The math, the engineering constraints, the energy and material bottlenecks, they all converged on the same cruel verdict: impossible in time of war. He had told the Imperial Japanese Army that repeatedly, calmly, with calculations and diagrams. Politics, he believed, could not trump the laws of nature. Yes, America had bolder industrial muscle. They had factories and resources Japan lacked. But physics did not care about budgets. Uranium-235 would not separate itself any faster in Tennessee than it did in Tokyo. Nisha's certainty was not arrogance so much as professional rigor. He believed he had ruled out the possibility of an American bomb with the same quiet confidence a surgeon might carry into an operating theater. He was about to learn how catastrophically wrong that judgment could be at that same instant. 500 meters away from the Riken Institute, 3 aircraft cut a thin line across the morning sky. One of them was the B-29 bomber Enola Gay, cruising at 31,000 feet, its belly crammed with unusual cargo. Nestled in the bomber's bomb bay was Little Boy, a gun-type fission device built to detonate on a city. Inside that weapon rested 64 kilograms of uranium-235, refined to roughly 80% purity, an amount and a concentration that, to Nisha's calculations, should not have existed anywhere on Earth in 1945. Yet there it was, riding silently toward Hiroshima. The Americans had, without its most determined opponents suspecting, solved the problem not with a clever laboratory trick, but with industrial audacity. Down in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, a facility that officially didn't exist sprawled over 825 acres. Inside that secret city of production workers and concrete, they had assembled W152 calutrons, massive electromagnetic separators that were, in essence, mass spectrometers turned into industrial beasts. Each calutron needed enormous magnets, So much metal that wartime copper shortages forced the United States to borrow 14,700 tons of silver from the Treasury to wind their coils. Oak Ridge would employ 75,000 men and women, many of them unaware they were handling the raw materials of apocalypse. The city rose in secret in 1943 to serve an impossible purpose. Oak Ridge, however, was not the whole story. Across the western Washington landscape at Hanford, another secret city hosted 50,000 workers and massive graphite-cooled reactors that pumped out plutonium, a parallel path to the same terrible end. The American program had hedged its bets: electromagnetic separation, gaseous diffusion, thermal diffusion, and nuclear reactors. The industrial scale of the effort, whole towns, borrowed treasure, tens of thousands of laborers, transformed theoretical possibility into grim reality. While Nisha agonized over diffusion columns and heat gradients in Tokyo, the United States had erected cities whose sole reason for being was to break the physics barrier through sheer scale. Back in Tokyo, Nisha still had not the slightest inkling of the scale of what was coming. The Reichen Institute's fluorescent lights hummed. A soldering iron cooled on a bench. Papers were stacked in neat piles. He turned a wrench, consulted a graph, frowned, and then, as scientists often do, allowed himself a moment's private calculation, an exercise in beautiful, abstract numbers separated from the chaos of war. The ordinary domestic sounds of Tokyo that morning, bicycles on cracked pavement, vendors setting up, the distant thud of an army truck, had no way to prepare him for the sound that would be traveling at the speed of light toward his world. At 8:15 a.m. and 17 seconds, Little Boy exploded 1,968 feet above Hiroshima. The physics converted to horror. A fireball that rose to blistering temperatures, 18 million degrees Fahrenheit, in 1/1,000,000th of a second. A shock wave traveled outward at roughly 984 miles per hour. In the first second alone, the blast killed on the order of 80,000 people. Instant, merciless. Within minutes, a mushroom cloud punched into the sky and climbed toward 40,000 feet. A vertical column of smoke and heat and human catastrophe. Tokyo's communications were ragged by mid-1945. The relentless firebombing of the capital in prior months had shredded infrastructure. Yet even in that damaged network, anomalies rippled outward. At 8:16 a.m., Hiroshima's radio station cut off in the middle of its broadcast. Military channels from the city fell silent. Initial, confused dispatches described what sounded like a powerful conventional raid, but the scale and the oddities did not fit. 3 aircraft, only 3, could not deliver the kind of ordnance required to flatten a city. The reports were incoherent fragments, a blinding flash, a cloud that had not existed an hour earlier. Glass melted, concrete shattered, people vaporized in a way that did not match incendiary bombing. By noon, more information had trickled into Tokyo, but it came as rumor braided with terror. Survivors who had crawled from the edges of ruin described a flash brighter than sunlight, a heat that stripped flesh and ignited clothing at a distance, and walls that bore permanent silhouettes where living people had once stood. Shadows burned into the very fabric of buildings by a thermal pulse. Reinforced concrete, which should have withstood ordinary explosives, had been shredded or vaporized at ground zero. The air tasted metallic and smelled of burning things, and something else that no one could name. When the reports reached Nisha, something in him shifted from scientific curiosity to a cold, professional dread. The pattern matched, horribly exactly, the theoretical predictions for a nuclear detonation. The energy release, the fireball radius, the way the mushroom cloud rose. This was no conventional raid. The numbers pointed to a yield in the neighborhood of 15 kilotons of TNT equivalent. Those calculations did not depend on patriotism or hope. They were arithmetic. Nisha's training forced him to accept them, but his mind fought the consequence. If the Americans had, against his calculations, built a uranium weapon, how many more could they make? Nisha did the math again under pressure. He told the Imperial Japanese Army something they clung to like a lifeline. Even if this was an atomic bomb, he believed the Americans had consumed the bulk of their available enriched uranium to make it. Producing another weapon would take months, perhaps years. There would be time to negotiate. There would be a window to find terms that spared the nation further annihilation. That second judgment was as catastrophic as the first. He was wrong. Unknown to him then, the American program had its redundancies. Fatman, a plutonium implosion device, was already assembled and being readied on Tinian Island. The United States did not need months to follow with a second strike. It had the logistical and material depth to act again if it chose. By the following day, August 7th, Nisha's colleagues from the Reichen Institute had reached Hiroshima to investigate. Dr. Tsunesaburo Asada, one of Nisha's former students, walked through a landscape that had been unmade. He carried a Geiger counter that clicked not in warning so much as in punctuation, an insistence that this was no ordinary explosion. Radiation readings were unmistakable. The scientific signature of fission, gamma and neutron fallout, persistent ionizing contamination, stamped the ruins as the scene of a nuclear event. Yet even with confirmation, many details exceeded prior models. Their theoretical work had anticipated blast and initial radiation, but not fully the breadth of thermal effects and the way they would combine with existing fires to create firestorms. Whole neighborhoods ignited not simply from blast, but from the sustained thermal pulse that set tinder ablaze across streets and parks, and from secondary conflagrations that burned with a ferocity that obliterated life and shelter alike. Radiation sickness would follow in days and weeks. Invisible at first, but lethally certain, a second, slow weapon that would continue to kill long after the ash settled. At the Imperial Palace, Emperor Hirohito received reports with the same mixture of confusion and dread that rippled through the command center. The High Command splintered between those who insisted this was elaborate enemy propaganda and those who recognized, with trembling clarity, that war had shifted into an arena none of them had truly imagined. Officers demanded answers. Scientists were summoned as if they could conjure certainty from chaos. Nisha, summoned out of his laboratory and into a ruined city's nerve center, carried with him only the instruments of his discipline, equations, models, and the professional honesty that forced him to say, in plain terms, that this awful event matched the predictions for an atomic explosion. The realization that followed was not only scientific, but profoundly human. Men and women he worked beside, colleagues and students like Asada, had been transformed from theorists into witnesses and victims in a single morning. The moral weight of invention settled heavily. A human mind had unlocked a set of reactions that, when multiplied by industrial capacity, could erase cities. Nisha's certainty about the impossibility of an American bomb had been a comfort born of rigorous reasoning. Its collapse was painful and absolute. In the days after, the full implications spread outward. The United States industrial commitment, the secret cities, the borrowed silver, the tens of thousands of laborers, had turned a theoretical fissile material into an instrument of war. Japan discovered, with sinking clarity, that science plus industry plus logistics could outpace the neat boundaries of laboratory calculations. The Reichen Institute's small, beleaguered efforts were dwarfed by a scale of production that had been conceived, funded, and executed in strict secrecy. And yet, even in the face of technical explanation, the human story remained. The immediate agony in Hiroshima, the people vaporized or burned, the scared survivors wandering through a landscape that had become unrecognizable, the Geiger counter's unceasing clicks, and the moral reckoning in the minds of scientists like Nisha, who had thought they understood the limits of what could be achieved. Their models had been right about the physics, but not about the human will and industrial horsepower that would turn theory into catastrophe. It was a morning that taught a terrible lesson. That knowledge, once married to scale and secrecy, could reshape the world in a single instant, and that even the most disciplined intellects could be blindsided when human ambition ran faster than the equations that tried to contain it. Asada collected samples of fused sand and metal with the meticulous calm of a man trained to read what the earth itself would say if you knew how to listen. He moved through the cratered streets near Ground Zero with gloved hands and a quiet concentration that bordered on reverence, as if each shard of glass, each warped filament of metal, were pieces of a language he had once studied in textbooks and now had to translate for a nation that did not yet grasp what those signs meant. Ordinary sand, he knew, behaves like a very patient rock. Heat it enough and slowly enough and it will soften, flow, and then resolidify into glass, but only at specific temperatures and under particular conditions. The fused sand he found around the blast center was not the kind of glass thrown up by a conventional incendiary. It was smooth where it should have been granular. It had bubbled and flowed and taken on a color that made him pause. A greenish sheen lay across the shards, subtle at first, then unmistakable. These were the fingerprints of a heat that did not merely burn, it liquefied, it transmuted. It rewrote mineral structures in a language that only extreme temperatures could speak. Asada boxed the samples carefully and took them back to the laboratory, where instruments that felt quaint in comparison to the devastation outside hummed to life. He heated fragments in crucibles, measured melt points, watched with a scientist's detached horror as seams of sand liquefied under controlled flames. From his measurements, he calculated the minimum temperatures required to produce that particular type of glass, over 3,000 degrees Celsius. The figure was not a number chosen for effect. It was a precise threshold. It confirmed, with an authority instruments rarely grant to human testimony, that some event had produced heat far beyond any conventional bomb. But heat alone was circumstantial if one was trying to distinguish catastrophe from a new kind of weapon. The decisive evidence lay in the atoms themselves. Asada turned to spectroscopic analysis, the methodical study of light and the radiation residues that remain when matter has been torn apart and rearranged. In the debris, he looked for isotopes that should not be there unless a nuclear chain reaction had occurred. He examined gamma spectra, counted decay rates, compared peaks in charts to known signatures. Spectroscopy, in Asada's hands, became a forensic microscope into the event's soul. The patterns of residual radiation and the specific isotopes present in the rubble acted like a chemical witness stand. When the data were plotted and the lines matched against reference spectra, the verdict was unambiguous: uranium-235. The isotope ratios and decay markers corresponded to fission products produced when uranium-235 splits. The Americans had used a uranium device. Nisha's earlier, reluctant conclusion that an atomic weapon had been deployed was now backed not by hearsay or rumor, but by the unblinking testimony of physics. When Asada's report, the charts, the sample logs, the spectral peaks reached Tokyo on August 8th, it arrived like a bell tolling through a fog. Nisha read it with hands that trembled little, because he was a man who had learned to let numbers speak, but his chest tightened as each page confirmed the worst. The Americans had not stumbled into an improbable success. They had industrialized enrichment. They had solved the problem he had called practically insoluble. That evening, in the dim light of his laboratory, Nisha sat amid the humble tools of the Reichen Institute, thermal diffusion columns whose tubes gleamed dully under the lamp, a small cyclotron that hummed with patient energy, notebooks full of equations and careful annotations. He reran the sums he had tried to keep apart from his emotions. 64 kilograms of uranium-235 at roughly 80% purity. The figure in Asada's analysis was not a laboratory curiosity. It implied industrial throughput on a scale that made his own work look like hobbyist tinkering. If Oak Ridge and the other American facilities had, in intelligence estimates, been pushing serious enrichment efforts for roughly 2 years, then the math spoke plainly. To produce that quantity of weapons-grade uranium in that time required separation capacity at least 1,000 times greater than Japan's entire program. 1,000. The number was not rhetorical hyperbole. It was a sober estimate, born of production rates, throughput per separation unit, and the physics of isotopic separation. The implications hit with the cold clarity of a chemical reaction, where Nisha and his colleagues had relied on painstaking theoretical work and slow, painstaking experimental scale-up. The Americans had marshaled entire cities and factories to do the heavy lifting. The scale was staggering. It meant that while Nisha had been scraping for parts and pleading for resources, the United States had been organizing labor, money, and material in a manner that rendered Japan's constraints irrelevant. But the most chilling consequence was not industrial disparity alone. It was what industrial capacity implied for production cadence. With a 1,000-fold advantage in separation capability, the Americans did not simply possess a single, unique munition. They possessed a sustained capability. Nisha worked through production rate estimates late into the night, modeling scenarios, translating facility size into probable output. His calculations suggested an awful possibility. If Oak Ridge was large enough to yield a single 64-kilogram store of high-enriched uranium, it could, given raw materials and magnets and power, replenish that stock on a schedule measured in weeks or months. Japan, he realized, had no meaningful defense. No anti-aircraft battery could contest the sky against weapons that could be delivered singly and with devastating effect. No strategic maneuver could counteract the arithmetic of enrichment and delivery. With those conclusions etched into paper, Nisha drafted his report for the Imperial High Command. He wrote as a scientist, precise, methodical, uncluttered by rhetorical flourishes, but the urgency underpinned every sentence. "The Americans have demonstrated capabilities far beyond our estimates," he wrote. "They possess not an isolated device, but the potential for serial production. Continued resistance is therefore, by any reasonable projection, futile." He appended his calculations, his isotope charts, his estimates of facility scale and production cadence, and he sealed the document with the kind of finality only cold numbers provide. The report reached the Supreme Council for the direction of the war, the Big Six who bore the weight of Japan's fate, on the morning of August 9th. The Council was already reeling. A midnight communiqué had announced the Soviet Union's sudden declaration of war, and the strategic picture had fractured on multiple fronts. At their meeting, the Council argued over terms, over honor, over the calculus of survival. They weighed the political and cultural implications of surrender against the military reality that closed around them like a tightening noose. At 11:02 a.m., as debate continued in ornate chambers, Fat Man detonated over Nagasaki. There was no need, this time, for field samples or delayed laboratory analysis. The use of a second atomic weapon within 3 days and the distinct nature of its destruction confirmed what Nisha's calculations had feared. The Americans had not relied on a single experimental success. They had developed parallel pathways to fission. Nagasaki's devastation, when the preliminary analyses were pooled, bore the spectral signature of plutonium-239. The U.S. had reactors producing plutonium from uranium-238. Hanford and its reactors were not mere rumors, but active, functioning production plants. Where Nisha's team had been committed to the single approach of enrichment and theoretical purity, the Manhattan Project had pursued redundancy and scale. In the aftermath of the surrender and the occupation, more details spilled out. The financial bill for the American effort, $2 billion in 1945 currency, became a shorthand for the scale of commitment. And the human footprint, roughly 130,000 workers across multiple secret sites, dozens of Nobel laureates and hundreds of the world's leading physicists, made clear that this had been organized at a national level unlike anything the world had seen. NIGO, Japan's clandestine program, had fewer than 100 personnel and a budget that would not in practice cover a month of Manhattan Project operations. The comparison was not merely quantitative, it was structural. The Americans treated the bomb as an engineering problem to be solved through redundancy, procurement, and factory-scale processes. Japan had treated it as a specialist scientific pursuit that presumed resource parity and overlooked the leverage that industrial organization conferred. After the surrender, American occupation scientists toured the Reichen Institute and treated Nisha with a mixture of professional respect and a dawning comprehension of what the photographs and logs could not fully convey. They told him gently that his thermal diffusion approach was theoretically sound, and that the US had in fact used thermal diffusion in certain contexts. But they also, perhaps unintentionally, revealed the cold arithmetic that had decided the contest. Money, laboratories, power plants, magnet coils wound in quantities that required borrowing national silver reserves. These were the differentiators. Nisha's science had been correct. It had simply lacked the industrial wings to carry it into a weaponized outcome. There is a particular cruelty to being outbuilt rather than outwitted. In Nisha's final years, he died in 1951. He reflected not on errors of physics, but on a failure of imagination. He had projected his own constraints onto an adversary and assumed that all scientific labor would be bounded by similar scarcities. He had believed that the laws of nature were the final governor on what could be achieved. He had failed to see how national industrial capacity, production lines, secret cities, and a willingness to marshal every available resource could render theoretical barriers practically surmountable. The lesson, he wrote in notes that survive, was bitter and simple. In the modern era, scale can be the decisive variable. Elegance of theory, Nobel-worthy insight, and correct equations matter. But without an economy to implement them, they can be outpaced by brute organizational force. The Americans had not simply outsmarted Japan's scientists. They had reorganized an economy and a society to do what physics alone did not forbid. As the years stretched after the war, historians would debate motivations, ethics, and alternatives. But for Nisha, in the immediate aftermath, the calculus was painfully personal. He had devoted his life to understanding the atom. He had believed in the sovereignty of scientific truth over the noise of politics. In the week between Hiroshima and Nagasaki, he had been forced to confront a new reality that in wartime, and perhaps beyond it, resources and organization could convert possibility into apocalypse. And in that recognition, he found a sorrow that no amount of theoretical clarity could ease. A sorrow for the victims, for a country that had misjudged the scale of its opponent, and for the fragile illusion that knowledge alone could ever be enough when measured against industrial power.